Hi, my name is Kelly McCall, and I am the Permitting and Plans Manager for Renaissance Homes in Lake Oswego. First, I just want to thank you for taking the time and getting involved in this very important issue. It may not seem serious now, but moving forward with this overlay will produce negative impacts on the Palisades neighborhood for generations to come. As part of Renaissance over the last 8 years, it's been my job to make sure all of our projects are code compliant. I personally see every project through the review phase of each department from intake to approval. With my team at Renaissance, we have successfully permitted and built over 100 homes in Lake Oswego. So I can tell you firsthand that the planning and zoning code for Lake Oswego is already very complicated and restrictive. Adding an additional overlay is just going to make things worse. Without getting into the really hairy stuff like subcodes, exemptions, and clauses to specific certain zones, here are the basics. This criteria already applies to all new residential construction in Lake Oswego. Floor area ratio, or FAR. This is the allowed ratio of the floor area relative to the size of your lot. As with most of the development code, there are some special circumstances and exemptions that can be applied for, but let's not get all muddled up in that. Lot coverage is another major design parameter. Any permanent structure over 30 inches in height is considered part of your allowed lot coverage. This number is based on the zoning of your property, size of your lot, and the proposed height of your design. Now let's quickly talk about zoning. Most lots in the Palisades neighborhood are zoned either R75 or R10, and they must comply with these setbacks and height restrictions. So far, all of these are fairly basic, black and white criteria that most jurisdictions follow when it comes to new development. Here's where things get more complex. The city of Lake Oswego has many additional design standards. Here are a few key examples of what I mean. Side yard setback planes and street-facing setback planes. This code requirement literally determines the massing of the home's design and how much square footage can be allowed on the upper floor versus the main level. Side yard appearance and screening. This code requirement presents a few different options for compliance, but the general idea is to have variance along the sides of your house for visual interest. Garage location and appearance. This section of the code is already incredibly lengthy and restrictive. There are many options depending on how your property is set up, the overall width of your home in relation to your garage, and even the length of your driveway. The intent of the code is to create curb appeal by reducing the amount of garage exposed to the street. I think we can all agree that having a large garage is very desirable in this area, but note there are already many measures in place to either reduce their appearance or make them more visually appealing. In addition to the home's design, there are also site-related factors that must be considered for any new development. Each project must include a stormwater management plan, which typically includes a set-aside area on the lot for a rain garden planter or some kind of system underground. Additionally, each project requires thorough erosion control plans that take the whole project into consideration for the duration of the project. As we all know, trees are extremely valued in this neighborhood, and their preservation and protection is a huge priority during all stages of development. The proposed overlay addresses a possible incentive for retaining mature native species trees by increasing allowed lot coverage. However, the reality of that incentive being applicable will be determined exclusively by the location of the tree. My point with all this is, the current development code is already very comprehensive and restrictive. The additional criteria of this overlay will only further restrict design opportunities and create long-term unintentional consequences. This is an example of an existing house in your neighborhood that would be considered out of compliance if constructed today. The garage is proud of the dwelling, the driveway exceeds 30 feet in width, the home's footprint encroaches both side yard setbacks. For this zone, R10, this home would need to have 10 feet on both sides. As of May of last year, when the demolition code was amended, a remodel exceeding 50% of the structure would require both a demolition permit and a new single-family residential permit, essentially making this project new construction. While what is currently proposed by the subcommittee specifically states that remodels are exempt from the overlay, it would appear that any major remodel would also be required to adhere to the overlay criteria. For example, if this homeowner wanted to add a second story, they would be extremely limited on their options and square footage based on the existing setbacks and how the proposed 612 side yard setback falls versus the 1212 side yard setback planes. The blue represents what would be allowed and in compliance with the current code. The red represents what would be allowed with the 612 side yard setback plane proposed by the overlay. As you can see, this drastically reduces the amount of square footage allowed and creates an odd and imbalanced design aesthetic. In my experience at Renaissance, I have learned the realities of new residential construction. I have also experienced market trends and how important it is to build for the current market. Here are some examples of homes we've built or are in construction right inside your neighborhood and abide by the current code. Each of these homes are thoughtfully designed with the new owner in mind and offer amenities that growing families are looking for. Here is the most current list of overlay restrictions that the Palisades Neighborhood Subcommittee has provided. This was drafted just a few weeks ago. Should this overlay take effect, all of the designs you just saw would need to be drastically modified, creating ill-proportioned upper floors, a huge reduction in square footage, and further reduces valuable garage and parking spaces. Now let's go through each proposed criteria. Applicability. Apply to new builds, demolitions, not to remodels or additions as previously mentioned. By the current code, any significant remodel exceeding 50%, which is very typical for a remodel, would fall under the criteria of this overlay just as if it were a new build. Interior side yard setback planes. By reducing the angle of the side yard setback plane, the overall design aesthetic is directly affected. Homes will have to be tiered or cake-shaped to be in compliance, and this style would become the only design option moving forward. Also, available square footage will drastically be reduced on the upper floor. Allowing a 10% increase in lot coverage in relation to tree preservation will rarely be applicable. The root and canopy structures of mature trees being retained will dictate the footprint and design. It makes the most sense to go up versus out to gain square footage, but if you can't go up due to the side yard setback plane reduction, then you have to go outward, and cutting into a tree root or canopy zone are not conducive to tree preservation. So there is no real lot coverage incentive presented by this concept. Plantings and buffering plan. The specifics of this concept are unclear, but we can assume the intent of this concept is to limit the amount of impervious surface or hardscaped area on the property, much like other overlays. Reducing the amount of impervious surface allowed will reduce parking pads for cars, RVs, and boats. An unintended consequence to this measure will be more vehicles on the street. Garage appearance and location. This concept creates the same problem but in a more severe way. Reducing the allowed width of a garage even further than what is already allowed will reduce the amount of parking spaces for cars, trailers, and boats. As a result, homeowners will be forced to store their vehicles and vessels outside on their driveway or in the street. This is a boating community filled with several adventure-driven people who have toys and/or additional vehicles. Large garages make sense in this neighborhood. Driveway approaches. The intent of this concept also remains unclear, as the existing code is already very restrictive. Currently, only one driveway approach is allowed for lots less than 75 feet wide, without utilizing any exceptions to the code. A maximum entrance width of 30 feet is also a code requirement. Part of the appeal of living in Lake Oswego is the diversity of different architectural designs. No one here would prefer their streets loaded with one or two cookie-cutter designs and a handful of color options, right? Well, if you make the code restrictive enough, eventually all the homes will start to look drastically similar because someone will find that magic formula of what works for the market and what is also code compliant, and that will be a predetermined shape. Quite possibly this cake shape seen here. So by supporting this overlay, you'll be locking in a future design aesthetic, and it probably isn't everyone's cup of tea. So how does this affect you? Supporting this overlay is a slippery slope. By adding more restrictive measures to future designs, you will limit your options for how your property can be developed. This will reduce the value of your property. Alternatively, if you feel like your property would benefit from the criteria proposed by this overlay, you have the ability to put deed restrictions on your property without encroaching on the rights of others. As someone seeing this from the outside, it would appear that the Palisades Neighborhood Association is acting more as an HOA and not really considering the long-term impacts of this proposal. Let's face it, with the market today, builders and investors are pretty much the only ones buying. Builders will buy based on how much they can create and sell on a lot. Obviously, price per square foot is a huge factor, but there are also other things to consider. Things like time and interest, design aesthetics, curb appeal, what will actually sell a home, marketability, what do people actually want, construction costs, etc. If the allowable square footage isn't high enough and the design standards don't fit the desires of the market, a builder will either pass or offer significantly less than asking price. On the other hand, you also have investors. The investors circling this area like vultures are typically from out of town and have no incentive to maintain the standards within your community. They'll buy your properties, provide the bare minimum maintenance, and then rent them out for as much as possible. Investors like these destroy communities. We've all seen it, and I'm sure you'd like to avoid that. Please consider not only how this will directly affect you as a property owner, but also how supporting this overlay will negatively impact the greater long-term good of your community. As of now, you pretty much have the freedom to be able to develop your property however you wish. However, if this overlay is adopted into the code, you will have an entire list of restrictions to compete with. This is your chance to maintain and take control of your property rights. Thank you all for coming and hearing me out on the importance of this issue.